want to leap forward again then to the 1922 committee. You've been chairperson of that group of backbench MPs since 2010. How do you describe your role? Are you one of the fabled, men in grey suits of Westminster mythology who tells ailing prime ministers that it's time to go, or is it actually much more mundane and less macabre than that?
Well, I hope it is. The first thing to say, I think it's always important in an Irish context to point out that the name of the committee has nothing whatsoever to do with Ireland.
Yeah.
But essentially, the Conservative backbenchers voted in 1922 at a meeting at the old Carlton Club to bring the wartime coalition to an end, largely, I think, because they thought that the Conservative Party was in a position to win an election outright. The government had no choice but to go to the country because the majority was voting against essentially, I suppose, it was a vote of no confidence, and went to the country. We won a substantial majority. The committee started as a committee just of the 1922 intake of Conservative MPs. But when they decided they would set this up a few months later as a kind of self-help group, they went to see the chief whip and told them what they were doing. And he was a very wise man who, instead of seeing this as an incipient revolt of some sort and something that had to be suppressed at all costs, he saw it as an opportunity and said, well, that's great. Would it be helpful if I sent one of my whips to every one of your meetings to tell you what the forthcoming business is going to be? And they said that would be very kind. So right from the inception of the committee, we haven't been a secret society. It's always been an open channel of communication with the whip's office and therefore with the front bench. The 22 executive, the elected representative executive committee, does meet privately. So that may be sometimes where we have slightly more interesting discussions behind closed doors, and it almost never leaks. But the committee as a whole, effectively, very early on, it developed into being a committee that encompassed all Conservative backbench members of Parliament. So the analogy really is with the Parliamentary Labour Party. We could be called the Parliamentary Conservative Party. We're Conservative, so we keep our old name. And so the real core of the job is to try to make sure there is a good channel of communication with the party leader, with the cabinet, through the chief whip, and with the party machinery as well. And that's done in all sorts of different ways. We have the Prime Minister or cabinet ministers come to speak to meetings of the committee, answer questions, hear views. The executive might see the Prime Minister, might see the party chairman, chancellor. I would see those people probably more regularly and more likely in a one-on-one opportunity to give some advice on where the party is.
Yeah. Try to quantify that for us, because there's a question, a specific one from Jane I want to get in afterwards. How much face-to-face time does the job of chairman of the 1922 entail with the Prime Minister? Is there a weekly meeting? Is there a monthly meeting? How much face-to-face time do you get?
It varies very much from time to time, and also from Prime Minister to Prime Minister. I'm now on my third Prime Minister. And I've always been very keen not to say I want to see the Prime Minister every week or every other week or whatever it might be. I'd far rather see the Prime Minister when there's a point to it. And so I think the first thing is, if I want to see the Prime Minister or speak on the phone, I can. And I think that's important. So if something is flaring up as an issue, there's a live concern or something which I think is going to upset a lot of colleagues, I can make sure that is fed in. As a rule, I would say the times when the chairman of the 22 sees the leader of the party most often are probably the times when we're in the deepest water. So I certainly got to a point where I was seeing Theresa May on a more regular basis than probably either of us would have wanted.
That feeds nicely into the specific question from Jane, which is, which Prime Minister did you have the best relationship with? Or I suppose, did you get on well with Mrs May, who obviously had so many issues with backbench MPs? Which PM did you have the best relationship with, is the question from Jane.
Gosh, I mean, some of this is going to have to wait for my much anticipated memoirs
Right.
in due course. But I think of course they're all very different, and certainly David Cameron, very urbane, very charming, and I think we would have very forthright conversations. He would tell me all sorts of things. Something a lot of journalists will tell you as well. David Cameron was massively indiscreet, so would tell you things that probably you weren't meant to know. I had a number of occasions where he'd say something to me and I'd bump into the cabinet minister responsible for the policy that he'd just told me about when I was on my way back to the Commons, and I'd say, "Oh, I gather you're doing this," and they'd look very worried and say, "Really?" So sometimes it helped you to understand how little involvement some cabinet ministers have in their own policy briefs. Then Theresa, I'd entered Parliament with Theresa in 1997. Oddly, we both made our maiden speeches in the same debate on the bill to abolish the assisted places scheme, which we both opposed. This is a scheme to help people from less advantaged backgrounds to get places at independent schools. Theme there on social mobility. But Theresa, she's not a very.
Can you be friends with Theresa May?
I'm sure you can be, but she's
right.
she's not a sort of genial hail fellow well met. She's very private. She's very quiet. So the contrast there was immense. And as I used to say to people, when I saw David Cameron, he'd have his shoes off and his feet up on the table and his hands behind his head as he sprawled on the sofa. And when I went in to see Theresa, we'd drink tea from china cups with saucers. And then Boris Johnson is a different thing altogether.
Oh, well, how different is he then, I suppose?
Boris.
On that spectrum of David Cameron to Theresa May, where in the middle does Boris Johnson lie?
Yes, or a different spectrum altogether. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
I would say he's brilliant at keeping talking until the meeting's over. That's the challenge.
Right. Okay. Have you had a preference out of the three in terms of what you've been trying to do and achieve?
That'll wait for the memoirs, I think.
Right. Okay. I want to ask about this. It's an interesting position to be in the governing party, but a backbench MP, because there are so many. There are multiple motivations at play. You've got your party in government. You want to follow your own agenda, maybe your constituency's agenda. Maybe you've got your fingers crossed for a cabinet job. What is the job of a governing party backbench MP?
Well, I think in general. My position is rather different, but in general, I've just got a huge amount of sympathy for backbench members of Parliament, especially when you're in government, because there's a great tendency the sort of Westminster system would really rather not hear from you in those circumstances. They want you to go and dutifully vote with the government on every occasion. They want you maybe to make very loyal interventions in the chamber in order to demonstrate that we all love each other dearly at all times. But in terms of an actual contribution to debate, maybe questioning the direction in which policy is moving on something, even if it's an area in which you've got considerable expertise, generally governments don't much want to hear from their own backbenchers. And an opposition backbencher has far more license generally to get engaged in campaigning, get engaged in debates in the chamber, in committees in the House of Commons, and can be much more enjoyable.
Is that reality damaging to governance, to democracy in the UK, in your view?
Well, I've said many times before, I think there's a very big problem in that in our constitutional arrangements, without a proper separation of powers, there is a kind of confusion of the linkage of, if you like, performance and reward. I think if you ask most people in the public what they want from their members of Parliament, they would quite like somebody who is a kind of independently minded local champion who will go out and speak without fear or favour. They don't necessarily, I mean, they will also want somebody who helps to make sure their preferred party is in government, if that's possible. But they don't necessarily want somebody who's going to agree with their party leadership at all times. They quite like the idea that members of parliament are going to be a little bit sparky and a little bit difficult and are going to put a bit of challenge. But the kind of career structure and rewards in the House of Commons all run in the opposite direction. More often than not, if you want to get a quote-unquote promotion, get paid more as a government minister, get the ministerial driver, the extra status and the extra airtime that go with that, you're more likely to do that by towing the line than you are by being difficult.
How regular an occurrence is this then, Sir Graham? How often do you think you see somebody, a new MP coming in a brand new intake who starts off very principled? And I mean, can you recognise the trajectory, which is that this person has seen the ministerial car driving past, and now they're voting a lot with the government and maybe that policy that they were very passionate about? I know. I mean, how can you recognise that trajectory in front of your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think some people would say it's the art of good whipping, which is the time when a backbencher votes in a way which isn't appreciated by the whip's office, and a whip takes them aside and says, "Such a shame. We all thought you had such a great future here," and so the little bit of the drip feed of you were going to do great things, but obviously only if you keep your nose clean. I think there is a danger in that, and I always try not to be overly critical of backbench MPs on either side of the House. They are existing within an ecosystem where it's always very easy to say, if only I can get that next step up the ladder, then I'm going to be important enough that people are really going to have to listen to me. I can remember Patrick McLaughlin, who's now in the House of Lords, but for many years he was Deputy Chief Whip in opposition, Chief Whip in government. He was party chairman, Transport Secretary, and Patrick said this to me once a couple of years ago. He said, when I was made a junior minister, he said, I thought, that's great, I'm going to have some real influence. And then I was told my job was to do whichever events the Secretary of State didn't want to do himself. And then I became the Deputy Chief Whip. Now I'm near the centre. I'm afraid it goes on. But it's what I would say is it's the most difficult balance to get right. And for a Member of Parliament, you can very easily always be the maverick, always cause difficulties for your party, and you might get a certain amount of public recognition and a little bit of notoriety here or there, but you probably will have no influence because your own party will find you annoying. So being sufficiently difficult to be the grit in the oyster, but without always being a pain in the backside. It's a very difficult spot to find.
Yeah, I want to ask more about the 1922 because I want to get on to Brexit and a bit of COVID as well. It's amazing we've got this far and haven't really talked about Brexit. One of those the big jobs of the chairman of the 1922 is to collect those letters of no confidence. So if we can dive into Brexit ever so slightly, the last moment, I suppose, of that significance was December 2018 again with Theresa May. Intense opposition to the Irish backstop element of her withdrawal deal. How does this process actually work? Does somebody hand you a letter in the corridor, secretly leave it on your desk? Does an aide come scuttling past and say and stick it in a bag? Or how does this work?
All of the above, but if it's not possible to be absolutely certain who has written the letter, then I would check. I did accept emails, for instance, but I only accepted them if I'd spoken to the individual as well, and just checked that it was going to happen. And obviously, the numbers aren't huge. 15% of the parliamentary party, famously in that parliament. It was 48. But I had all of the above. And
have you ever come across a fraudulent no confidence letter? That's implied. That's clearly what you're checking for. Have you come across one yet?
I haven't, but my predecessor, Michael Spicer, said that I think it was the time when there was an attempt to get the requisite numbers for a confidence vote in Ian Duncan Smith in 2003. He said he did have a lot of rather similar looking letters on Carlson Club headed notepaper. And when he checked with the people who'd apparently written them, they all denied it.
Wow.
I think it is just worth being cautious. As I've said before, one of the things that surprised me most, which again Michael Spicer had the same thing, is the odd occasions when colleagues will say publicly that they've written a letter calling for a no confidence vote to the chairman of the 1922 committee, but actually they haven't. Because you can almost understand why people would do the opposite, but that's an interesting one.
Do you know what? That's extraordinary that you would that your predecessor came. You know, people. I don't know why that particularly strikes me, making up notes of, on such an important issue. I suppose at the time Ian Duncan Smith wasn't in government, so there's a slight. But I don't know. I find that extraordinary. Did you vote?
Of course, they may not have been written by colleagues. They could have been written by other people claiming to be.
Oh well, yes, I suppose that's true. Yes, you've slightly salvaged the reputation of the parliamentary party there, only ever so slightly. Do you vote in the no confidence? You're the sort of the returning officer, I suppose, as chairman of the 1922. Did you subsequently vote in the confidence vote in Theresa May in December 2018?
Yes, but I wouldn't divulge how I vote. Similarly, in a leadership election, I wouldn't divulge.
Okay. Well, because it ties nicely to a question from Emily, which is, when did you know that Theresa May's time was up?
I think, if not before, when we had that December the 12th, 2018 confidence vote, and she won with, I think, 60%, or it might have been slightly over 60%, but it was something like 40% that had voted no confidence. And I thought that was going to be a difficult thing to come back from, particularly in those circumstances with very contentious stuff going on and with no majority. So it was just quite hard to see how that was going to end in any other way.
Okay. Were you sad to see you entered with Theresa May at the same time? Did you have any sympathy for her? She famously, whether she cried or not, there was certainly a display of emotion outside the front of Downing Street when she eventually left the office. Did you have sympathy for her, or have years at the heart of Westminster hardened your nose, Sir Graham?
I think, these are, it's always easy to forget, they're human beings. They're human beings who go through, enormous pressures. And I guess at that point, I think you would be very hard not to have sympathy for somebody. I also, I felt that Theresa was somebody who I believe always tried to do the right thing. Now, obviously, the negotiations didn't get to the right place, and I was the first person, I guess, to raise concerns about the Northern Irish Protocol. I went to see her privately before the thing was published, based on the press briefings that were going on, to say there's no way this is going to get through Parliament.
Yeah.
Of course there had been problems, and I wasn't always going to go along with what she was proposing, but I think she always tried to do the right thing, and I had sympathy for that.
I want to move on to that and the Brady Amendment. I suppose one thing that I'd like to ask off the back of what you've just said, Theresa May is obviously now a backbench MP, and has done a lot of work and has been praised, actually, I think, in a lot of quarters for stuff like domestic abuse during lockdown, all these kind of areas. What happens to, and is there a show of deference to somebody like Theresa May in the 1922 committee meetings? What kind of dynamic is that when a former prime minister, especially one who had as difficult a time as she did and received so much opposition from within her own party, what kind of dynamic is that for her to stick around? Because obviously David Cameron didn't for any length of time, and many other leaders don't.
Well, and it's become the default for leaders not to, prime ministers not to stick around, which I think is rather regrettable. And even though I didn't generally see eye to eye with Ted Heath, at least over European matters, he was there for my first Parliament. I thought it added something, having somebody who'd been in that most difficult job, leading government, to contribute in the House of Commons. I wouldn't say there's necessarily deference if Theresa, is in a meeting of the 1922 committee. I would certainly say there is respect, and I think these things again are really very difficult. There would be people who supported Theresa to the end, who maybe nonetheless were relieved when it was all over and thought, well, now we can move forward. And there will be people who thought, my God, I can't see how this is going to end well. We're going to have to change leader, and were pressing from early on to have a confidence vote, who nonetheless think that she's a decent woman and were sorry to see the way in which it came to an end.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is a respect for people who have been in the crucible,
heart of the storm,
borne all those things.